was thinking, oh dear.
Not the
Well,
first time, not the first time I've had that going from one.
Life. This is a three-part series exploring institutional death as a pathway to new life, to the new thing, as the prophet might say, toward the common good. My name is Daniel Pryfogle. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sympara. We are a multi-faith community with a public mission to repurpose religious assets for the common good. And my conversation partner today is Rick Mixon. Rick is a pastor in Costa Mesa, California, interim pastor for Fairview Community Church. He is an adjunct professor of pastoral care at Berkeley School of Theology at the Graduate Theological Union, a teacher, a counselor, a friend to many in this journey from death to life. And so I'm delighted that we get this opportunity to engage in this conversation again. This is our second installment. Our theme for this week is the peril and promise of death. Last week, our theme was the personal and communal work of death. And in our conversation, Rick and I talked about the reality of death, this moment in which we've convened in the midst of a global pandemic and other experiences of death, a time when congregations are facing even greater strains. We shared a quote from the spouse of a pastor who overheard her spouse say, "We die a little more every Sunday. We die a little more every Sunday." From there, Rick and I shared some experiences that shape our own affirmation of death, our early experiences of death that was personal or communal. And we talked about how those experiences, because we're both preachers' kids, were situated in the life of congregations. And so there was a way in which the congregations held a space for us in the midst of death that was suggestive for us of a possibility of embracing death as a path to new life. And that's what we really want to get into this week in this theme of the peril and promise of death. The possibility of that embrace of death. Our question last week was, how does death shape us personally? Our question this week is, why do we deny death institutionally? Why is that embrace of death so difficult, even though we know theologically or intellectually that life requires death? So that's what we want to get into with this week. We invite you to listen in a kind of fishbowl experience to Rick and my conversation for the next 30, 35 minutes or so. And then we're going to invite you to join in the conversation by asking your questions or making comments through the chat. And so to get started, Rick, we talked last week, we introduced the idea of death equivalence. This is language from Robert J. Lifton, who you spent a lot of time studying in your PhD work. What are we talking about when we speak of death, and what are death equivalents?
I discovered my copy of The Broken Connection by Lifton is shredded, and I went out looking for a new copy this week and discovered it's out of print, and the cheapest you can buy it is $84.
Oh,
So I'll just deal with my shredded one. But Lifton coined the term psychic numbing, and it's a phenomenon I worked with in my dissertation. But this notion that when we experience trauma, psychosomatically we go numb. That's almost inevitably the initial response, and then how do we crawl out of that numbness? And so that kind of numbness, that kind of death in life is, I think, where Lifton jumps off and talks about death equivalents. So, for instance, stagnation would be a death equivalent. depression is a death equivalent. I think to some degree anxiety is a death equivalent. There are these things in life that create what Dordezola calls they become death in life experiences. So those dimensions of being, being among the whatever leads to being sort of among the walking dead, if you will. Uh, uh, go to the notion of death equivalence, and so we experience them in life, and I think if we experience them over against what then Becker was trying to address in the whole notion of the denial of death, where we reach for things that somehow will make death go away or disappear or out of our consciousness.
So these death equivalents can be experienced institutionally as well, right?
Yeah, yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, personally and as well as institutionally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that could be the what? That could be the death of a vision. That could be last week's conversation, I made a brief mention about a church that burned down and then had to go through the process of rebuilding. That would be certainly a death equivalent, right?
Yeah, maybe more than anything, at least in my experience, more than anything, it's the death of tradition,
Mm-hmm.
or the death of an idealization of what the institution is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about most of us having been trained for the church of the 50s, which represents a kind of ideal, that post-war boom when the church was the center of community life, which probably is an idealization in and of itself, but we hang on to that. Um, yeah, so that's it's the challenge to that. We're not going back to that. That ship has sailed. You know.
And with death equivalents, then because they are akin to death, they involve some of the same uh, emotions surrounding death, um, the same reactions to a physical death. Um, we could is it fair to say that we could take kind of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and that they would have some relationship to death equivalents as well?
Oh yeah, yes, I think that's applicable. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you see those combinations of anger and regret, and I remember all of her
We're going to
fighting.
talk about denial today, for sure, as we reference Ernest Becker's work. Yeah. Last week, uh, one of the participants asked about signs of death, and we kind of rattled off a few that would be familiar to everybody on this call. But I wanted us to dig in a little bit more to that. So last week we mentioned numerical decline, financial decline, physical decline, both individual and congregational. The latter could be manifested in significant deferred maintenance. The building's falling apart, the roof is leaking, things haven't been repaired in many years.
Mhm.
What else would you add to that list? You
Uh,
mentioned last week, for instance, the decline in energy.
oh yeah, yeah, um, and a kind of maybe an obvious, but maybe just a felt sense of desperation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, I know we're going to talk more about Becker. I mean, um, there's an underlying dimension of fear, fear of the unknown, in particular, which is a driving force in the process of life, psychologically and theologically as well, probably. Um, so there's a kind of desperation to hang on to the thing that we know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The I mentioned numerical decline. That's not always a sign of death, right? I mean, there could be a group, a congregation, a community that's getting smaller, but is still very vibrant. Um, what did you say?
Well, I just say that, but as you and I both know that's a challenge to people who are leading churches is to not let numerical decline become a defining word in terms of, oh, there are fewer people, therefore we're dying, when that may not be the reality.
Mm-hmm.
There may be a core group of people there who are still dedicated, enthusiastic, and have energy to create something new, and to not lose sight of that potentiality, because we think numbers. It's all about numbers. I mean,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we all, I think, are familiar with that whole phenomenon. It's all about numbers.
right, right, right. Yeah, I shared the story of my father's pastoral ministry last week and the struggle in a small church for most of his career and his heroic efforts to try to change that numerically. And I was thinking earlier today that that was not all of his ministry. There were moments when um, he embraced the reality as it was and let go of the heroic effort and was present. It was even playful.
Yeah,
Um, and those are moments that I remember as well, that where there was another kind of energy was kicked up in our life together, because we weren't denying death anymore. We were um, as the poet Wendell Berry says, these passings resurrect a joy without defect, a life that steps and sings in ways of death, a life that steps and sings in ways of death. So I caught sight of that at different times in my childhood. After that question last week about these signs of death, I started thinking some more about those signs that I think are most significant. Piggybacking on what you said, Rick, about the decline in energy, I wanted to take that deeper and to say it's a decline in the capacity to imagine where energy comes from. If we think that it's just this group that's getting smaller and smaller, and the solo pastor bearing the weight of trying to make this thing happen and generate the energy, then that's a failure of imagination.
yeah,
Energy can come from many quarters, right across the street, in the neighborhood, from partners, from other organizations that share the mission of the religious community. So that was one thought I had, that if we really want to push that further, it's really the decline in the capacity to imagine alternative sources of energy.
yeah. Well, and Daniel, I want to push that further. I mean, I feel like that's my ministry. That's my call, is to push that further.
Mm.
Even in my dotage, I feel that. And let me just tell you just a tiny bit about where I am right now. I'm serving this little church in Costa Mesa that is an interim, and we are right in the middle of living with that tension as we try to discern the future for this congregation. And I keep pushing and pushing the leadership to say, look, this is a chance to try to reimagine what church might be. So the discernment questions we want to ask are, in maybe what church has been for you and what church is now, but what do you dream that church might be? What could church be moving into your future? And man, I get even from the leadership resistance to that. It's always is how do we uh, recharge the old forms? How do we fill the old wineskins?
Mm-hmm. I referenced last week my experience as an interim minister for a church adjacent to the University of Texas in Austin, and I told a couple of stories from that experience. One that relates to this issue of a decline in the capacity to imagine alternative sources of energy was I had coffee a couple doors down from this church with a graduate student, then invited her to walk down the street with me to kind of see the church site. And that day happened to be one of the first days back to school. And so members of the church were out, greeting students, passing out water bottles. I think it was a hot day in Austin, Texas. And I brought her up to a couple of longtime members and who had joined the church back in the 60s. And I introduced her. And then the gentleman said, so are you going to join our team?
Oh, yeah.
Said this to the student. And I interrupted and I said, no, we're going to join her team.
Yeah.
Whatever she's doing in the world, we want to be part of that. So it was a recognition that energy comes from other sources. So this student happened to be leading efforts on the other side of the street around social enterprise, innovation, embodiments of the very, the values that this church proclaimed, but they really had no connection, very little connection to that university across the street. It also showed you how this gentleman was kind of thinking in the old category, that she represented new life that was going to come into this old wineskin, and that was, I think that said volumes about a kind of lack of capacity to imagine another way, another source of energy, and then also kind of just denying the place of death that he would invite that person to come inhabit with him.
Daniel, that question is a key marker that I think every one of us probably has heard at some point. Are you going to come join us? And the minute you hear that question, that's a road to that's a road to death. I mean, that's a road to a death, at least a death equivalent, if not literal death.
Yes.
And that question is a marker to really pay attention to in terms of, no, that's, as you said, that's the wrong question. How can we join you in the vital work you're doing?
Yes, indeed.
We don't need you to come to us. We need to figure out how we can come to you.
Yes, exactly. So that leads me to another sign of death that I wanted to dig into a little bit more, which is the declining connections to the wider community. There's an inward turn in churches that are dying, and this is not a positive inward turn in terms of contemplation or spirituality. It is turning inward to try to preserve this thing that is naturally very important to the members, but is reflective of their or involves a kind of cutting themselves off from the wider community more and more. The theologian Sheila Briggs, I was just reading an essay by her this week, where she talks about the turn toward church as public domestic space, an extension of the family. So when we see the inward turn, it might be valorized, made, wrapped in language that sounds wonderful, like we're a family here. But there can be a shadow side to that this family doesn't leave its house. This family does not connect to strangers. So the decline in connections to the wider community, the related inward turn, I think those are also signs of death.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe some of you know the contemporary hymn, come in and sit down. You are part of the family. We are lost and we are found and we are part of the family. And I love that hymn. It's a wonderful hymn for him. But I think that's right. I think there's this. It's really another sign of death when we begin to circle the wagons because we're afraid of what's out there.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and we're afraid that we're going to lose our lives, so we circle the wagons. We turn inward in a way that ultimately is not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that's where the rubber hits the road of those who would find life need to be willing to lose life,
Mm-hmm.
to let go of something that you've held sacred in order to find something new.
Yeah. Yeah. The last sign that occurred to me, signs of death, would be the heroic efforts that we undertake to turn things around or to turn them back, as you say. Um, that can be valorized as too. That can sound really noble, like we're gonna fight to the end. We're gonna turn this ship around. We're gonna make this thing work. Well, that might be a sign of death. Uh,
Oh, Patty just raised that in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There are pastors, there is pastoral leadership who believe that's my calling.
mhm,
Uh, you
mhm,
know, um, and I know that for the dying, disappearing church, the notion of pastor as chaplain, especially pastor as hospice chaplain, it may be an important role that we play, but not if it doesn't not if somewhere it doesn't at least raise the question of new life or the possibilities of life beyond whatever death we're going through.
mhm, mhm. Let's talk a little bit about the denial of death. Ernest Becker's seminal work won the Pulitzer Prize, I think, in 70, 74, 75.
Yeah.
And he takes issue with the kind of the dominant thinking at that time in psychology that at the heart of the human condition we're working out issues related um, uh, to our families of origin and um, um, related to sublimation and um, sexual drive, however we want to define kind of the Freudian project. Um, and he's saying actually the at the heart of the human experience is this denial of death. Um, we do everything in our power to keep death at bay because death death represents not only the physical end, but the 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 loss of meaning. Um, um, it's hard to conceive of a world with meaning in the face of death. I think is one of his points.
Hmm.
Um, how how do you see this denial of death playing out institutionally?
Well, I mean, it's what we've been talking about. I mean, we do everything possible to preserve what we know or what we think we know, even over against the evidence that it's not working, that it's no longer meaningful. It obviously is not reaching younger people. The we talked a little bit last week about Diana Butler Bass and the death of Christendom. Um, but we again, it's that trying to hold on to the thing we know, um, because we're afraid of the unknown.
Mhm, mhm.
And I mean that's the core of, I think, what Becker was trying to say, is that uh, uh, because we've come so much to fear death and not to have any accommodation of death in our living. I mean, it's a chicken egg kind of thing, but consumerism, eternal progress.
Mhm.
We're going to cure every disease. We're going to heal every psychological. Uh, it's this kind of push for progress, and maybe some of that comes out of that post World War II boom. Where we somehow the war to end all wars kind of notion, and it's all about progress.
Mhm,
and
mhm.
and so we live in this world where the very nature of that move toward progress is a denial of the reality of death, and so we make no accommodation for it.
We in that progress, we elevate and celebrate our capacity to change things, to sustain things, to extend things, to extend life of individuals or institutions.
Yeah,
Um,
but
uh,
always for the more or the better or
yes,
bigger, or it's always. I mean, accommodating death can also be significant change, but we don't. There's not room for that because that's too scary. That's too yeah.
so Becker talks about immortality projects. These are the
Yeah.
activities that we engage
Oh,
in, the steps that we take to extend life, to deny death.
yeah.
And that's his language also to talk about heroism in the face of
Yeah.
death. You say a little bit about your experience at First Baptist Church of Palo Alto, where you were pastor for 12 years. Next week, we're going to talk about the process that you led that church through to death, to an intentional through an intentional embrace of their death. But before that, uh, there were some heroic efforts, right? And some maybe some divided thinking about what the church should be about. Tell us about that experience, Rick.
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, Daniel, that in some sense that was my first, and I probably guess my only settled pastorate, even though I was 50, pushing 60 when I went there. The So I went there with kind of high hopes. Man, somebody wants me to come be their pastor, and sort of high hopes and dreams about what the church could be. And let me just go back quickly to the fact that I served there as a seminary intern in the spring of 1973. So I had known this church for 50 years. And I remember thinking when I was the intern there, they had a good, what I call gray liberal pastor, and from my youthful perspective was kind of dull as dirt, and pardon me, but anyway, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, if this church had the right pastoral leadership, this could be so exciting. There could be so much there's so much creativity and so much possibility here.
Close to Stanford.
Close to Stanford, educated, really
Mhm,
creative people. This could just be so lively, and
mhm.
and of course I was only there for 6 months, and I moved on, and then I come back 50 years later, and it's a remnant, and it's a remnant of really of old timers who, if I had known what I know now, did not have the energy or bandwidth for new life. They
Mhm.
just I mean, we can talk more and will maybe about why that's true. But I came in thinking, sort of carrying those memories of 50 years ago and what could be, and try and maybe all of us who do pastoral leadership get caught in that phenomenon to some sense. We want to, gosh, we want to make this happen, and it's
Yeah,
my
yeah.
job to make this happen, and then I'm trained to make this happen, and
No one wants a congregation to die on his or
no,
her
no,
watch.
oh no, 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 absolutely not. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a failure,
yeah,
and, and
yeah.
so I came in with high hopes and expectations, and I would say that the first I was there almost 15 years, and the first maybe half of my time there was just a painful struggle over the disconnect between my vision and reality, the disconnect between the vision and reality of the people who were left,
Mm,
um, and a big piece of that was just not an unwillingness to accommodate the reality that this church probably does not have a future. It
mhm.
doesn't have a it doesn't have the future that we're hoping for.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the key, I think.
It needed to die one way or the other.
One
Death
way or the other.
equivalent, a physical death in terms of actually shutting the place down. I mean, we're going to talk more about that whole process next week.
Yeah.
But I think you're being honest with us and telling us just as a leader in a situation like that how difficult it is
Oh yeah.
uh, to uh, to live up with what our culture and even our religious tradition is telling us about take your stand and be bold and be courageous and fight this thing all the way to the end. The ego is on the line here.
Oh, for
uh,
sure.
and so we so very easily forget other things that our tradition has said. Unless a seed dies, there can be no new life. I would I've been in conversation with a lot of clergy who are leading congregations that are somewhere in this journey to death. For some, it's going to come very soon. For others, it might be a few years away. And I've noticed lately a kind of masculine energy and a feminine energy around death, and I haven't done any research on this, but it's leading to some questions that I'm curious about. The masculine energy might be most reflected in that heroic stance, um, and um, and that energy can be exuded by people of different genders. It is the dominant model of leadership in our culture, to fix it, to produce change, to make it happen, to deny death. And then on the other hand, I'm noticing this feminine energy, which is a willingness to let go, a willingness to hold space where we can be honest about the death that we're experiencing, the death equivalents, along with along with physical death, both individually and communally. Um, the Sympara is working with a number of congregations around reimagining their life together and how that might be uh, lived out in their space or through repurposing of their space. And many of those efforts are being led by women clergy who exude this feminine energy in the face of death. I wonder, again, you and I haven't done any research on this, but I wonder what it suggests to you based on your experience in your studies, Rick.
Well, I mean, this is kind of Daniel's just raised this week, so it's kind of new to me. But a couple of things I thought, Daniel. One, we got a whole lot of wise women in this room who
Mhm.
probably could comment on this in a way that would be very instructive.
Yeah.
But one thing that strikes me, my sister and I had this long conversation Sunday night on our weekly chat about the whole phenomenon of a non-binary world. I have to think more about the whole masculine feminine
Yeah.
division.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But that said, whether you have masculine or feminine energy or traits or whatever, the experience of loss is still significant, and the trap of wanting to prevent loss maybe manifests differently, but there still is that phenomenon of trying to deny death or prevent loss. Although I think what you may be suggesting is that from a more feminine perspective, that there's a gentleness and there's a nurturing and there's a reach for new life in feminine energy that maybe men are not as masculine energy is not as adept at. I have to really think more about that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
there's an approach to the
I'm
process.
thinking specifically just of a stance,
Yeah.
of the heroic stance versus a stance that's about creating kind of a holding space, a holding container
Well,
in which all of our experiences are. We're not denying anything. Um, yeah, whether we call that feminine or something else. I mean, my education around that kind of language of holding space, container, comes from women theologians, feminist theologians.
there'll be a distinction between maybe a holding environment and a sort of building or
Bulwark.
well, yeah. Well, but holding in the sense of uh, in the way that I say God holds us, as opposed to being involved in the work of building up.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's good. We're going to turn to questions in just a minute, but we called this session the peril and promise of death. We've talked a lot about the peril, the signs of death, our various efforts in the face of death. Um, um, what's the promise of death? What's the promise? I mean, when we say yes to death, when we actually acknowledge it, affirm it, what what might happen? Maybe you can tease a little bit where you're headed next week with the story of First Baptist, but I mean, whatever comes to mind. What?
Well, I mean, I think immediately, because I think often in terms of hymns and music. In the bulb there is a flower,
Mhm.
but an apple tree. Or I shared with you this week that beautiful passage from Howard Thurman. Look
Yeah.
well to the growing edge. Um, that it's in death that we find new life.
Mhm.
And the old saw that there is no resurrection without crucifixion, or there is no new life without death.
Mhm.
And that's the ultimate underlying promise of death, is that there is new life. And frankly, isn't that core to the gospel? I mean,
Yeah.
isn't that what we're called to preach or to teach or to live? That there is new life.
Mhm.
Isaiah and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. See, I'm doing a new thing, the prophet says, and that's in the midst of death. Yeah.
Even Jeremiah says that.
Mhm. Mhm.
The weeping prophet says that.
Yeah.
So
Yep. Yeah.
uh,
We're going to open it up now to your questions, and so we want to invite you to use the chat to ask your questions or make comments. And So please join the conversation here. Rick, while people are formulating their questions or their comments, I think that, so you've just articulated the kind of the theological um, uh, promise of death, theological and philosophical. That's part of our rich traditions. Um, in very practical terms, if we go back to talking about death equivalents, um, it seems that if we can letting go is a death equivalent, right? Letting go of a way of thinking, letting go of an approach, um, letting go to go back to my story earlier of are you going to come here, or are we going to go out into the community to accompany you wherever you are? What what uh, what type of letting go or examples of letting go come to mind that are suggestive for you of the promise of death, the life that can emerge through death?
Well, I have a daily, in my mind, conversation with Richard Rohr since I read his daily contemplations, and his take on the notion of losing life to find life is really a matter of losing the ego, losing the ego in the sense that I've got to hang on to my ego identity at all costs. And I mean, you can go a whole psychological thing on this, but he's actually saying letting go of ego, letting go of this investment in what it has to be for me, to maintain my identity, is really what opens us to the possibility of new life, new way of being that is less ego driven and more open to God's moving into that space and forming that space and then shaping that space in new and exciting ways that we never imagined. And I think that probably connects to Becker's thinking as well. When the ego gets sort of held as the only possibility, we lose the possibility of new life beyond it.
Nancy has written in the chat, I'm intrigued by this idea of lack of imagination as a death equivalent. And she notes that she's in a community of practice that is exploring imagination. What are the spiritual practices to encourage imagination? She asked. What are the spiritual practices to encourage imagination? Any thoughts, Rick?
Oh my, Nancy! I think I said last week you're in a really gifted community. It seems to me from your description of it. What are you reading? What are you watching? What are you listening to? In terms of, I mean, there's so much in the culture and the literature and in theology that invites us to imagination. Make that quotation from Thurman: look well to the growing edge, as a kind of key marker for how we live this life together. And one challenge, one thing I think we could do as pastoral leaders is that is that sort of classic notion of how do we work to make ourselves the non-anxious presence that provides the holding space for people to explore, for people to know their pain as well as their joy, and not to try to create an environment that protects against that. To how do we open ourselves up? I mean, that's part of that letting go of ego, I think. How do we open ourselves up to recognizing that not only do I not know, I don't even know what I don't know, and it's all right to live in that space. And that, in fact, maybe that's precisely why we need community, is we need places, we need space where we can hold one another in hold one another lightly in that exploration, in that openness to finding something new. Uh, I mean, you can probably tell us, Nancy, what some of the things are that you're doing that help, that just help inspire the imagination.
I love her question. What's coming to mind for me are two practices. One would be just getting out. I mentioned last week my admonition to the church in Austin to cross the street, to spend some time in the neighborhood. I had a conversation this past week, another program that Sympara is doing on conversations on sacred civic placemaking, and got to talk with the author Tim Sorens, who's the co-founding director of the Parish Collective, which is all about getting out into the neighborhood and building relationships in the neighborhood, being curious. He says, be curious, not helpful. So you're really out there building relationships with the neighborhood, and then that starts to cultivate imagination because you begin to see things in new ways. One of the things that you see when you move out into the neighborhood is assets. So that would be the second thing that I would note. The practice of paying attention to resources that are already present. I mentioned this sign of death as the lack of capacity to imagine alternative sources of energy. When you move out into the neighborhood, when you go for a walk, when you get to know your neighbors, you begin to see assets, resources, sources of energy that can be leveraged. So I think that those kinds of experiences are key to cultivating imagination. I love that. One of my favorite passages in scripture in the traditional language is seek ye first the kingdom of God. The way I say it is notice first the movement of God. Notice first the movement of God. It's already happening. The energy is already being manifested. We're invited to pay attention. Let's see, Allison has made a comment here. Maybe since women have the creative reproductive power of life, we are not so fierce in our denial of the overall cycle. Yeah. A container stays still. I don't feel still. Faith is on the move in this world, not stationary. Yeah, so she was resonating with the idea of women not being so fierce in the denial, but the metaphor of a container maybe is not the right metaphor.
Well, but can a container be
On the move, like a boat?
yeah, can a container ship? Yeah, how about a container ship? How about how about a carry-on? How about carry-on luggage? Just anecdotally, I remember that when I did the interim in Granville, Ohio, people struggling with the fact that because they're a church in a college town, a Baptist, so a traditionally Baptist college at that, ruin the fact that, well, we turn over every year or every 4 years or whatever. A student comes and they become part of the life of the church and then they're gone. And how can we be the church when, and, it struck me, well, what about church's way station? I mean, is that a possibility? That your role is to provide a kind of holding environment for people while they are here, with a willingness to let them go with your blessing when it's time to move on. And that ultimately, I think, becomes the story of Palo Alto. It's how do we ultimately let go.
Yeah.
Great.
There are some fantastic comments in the chat section. I won't go through all of these, but just draw your attention to that. There is another question from David, who writes, "I'm with Nancy, wondering about the connection of death, denial of death, and imagination. He agrees that failure of imagination is a sign of death, but he also wonders if imagination might be a tool for denying death more effectively. Um, uh,
Sure.
yeah, yeah. Although I, I think I'm reluctant to call that imagination. I think that might be cleverness or some kind of strategy. Um, I think of imagination at its core as involving this cycle of death and life. Um, the artist, the writer is um, experiencing a kind of death as they make their way to new life. That death could be the death of some form, the first idea, the first draft. Um, so but I think we can certainly see cleverness and strategy in denying death. Um, and that's the ego saying, I think I found a workaround. I
Mm,
think I found an in run around this. I
yeah.
know how we can get around this reality of death. Um, we may not have to experience this. In life cycle images of congregation, you've seen this, Rick, those kind of famous life cycle illustrate the life
Yeah.
cycle of organizations, and they head into this after birth and growth, which is the peak. Then they head into this kind of valley of decline. And across the valley of decline in a lot of these illustrations is a kind of lateral line that's not quite at the depths of the valley, but it's making a bridge across to the new thing that might be born. And I find in the illustration itself a kind of end around, a workaround that you don't have to go all the way to the bottom. There's a
Yeah.
way you can build a bridge. You don't have to experience death in its totality. You can get a little close. It might burn your feet a little bit, but then you build that bridge and you make your way up on the other side.
Yeah.
For me, a more honest illustration comes from Theory U, um, uh, which is a U, and it says, that we move down, down, down through the letting go, and then we come into the bottom of the U, which is this period of death, liminal space that we're going to be talking about next week. And one has to travel the very bottom there, or we have to travel as a community before the possibility arises of moving up the other side of the U. This is theory U.
Yeah.
Um, I don't
Well,
know. You're about to say something. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, 12 step has something to teach us about that. I mean, that change doesn't come until you hit
Rock
true
bottom. Yeah.
the true bottom,
Yeah.
or yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow. I
Yeah.
mean, I have to walk through it. I think of a client I had who was seriously depressed, and he was always talking about standing on this precipice, looking into this totally clouded over abyss, and wanting to leap across somehow. And I said, well, maybe the journey is into the cloud and through the down off the cliff through the whatever's below.
Yeah.
Or I think of, this accommodating the reality of death in the practice of whatever we do. I think songfully again of, the old song, when a lovely dream dies, smoke gets in your eyes, and you've got to accept that somehow and live through that,
Mm-hmm.
accommodate that, to be able to actually really approach anything new, or to do anything new.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Allison has made a comment that she hopes we will hear and reflect on strategies to combine congregations. And I was just thinking of that, Allison, in a and Rick will talk about this maybe next week in terms of the federation idea that was originally one of the possibilities that was explored in Palo Alto. But going back to David's question, the second part of his question, or is imagination what we unleash when we stop denying so much? So back now, if you can hold that thought, come back now to Allison's. I'm going to have a conversation later today with 5 churches that are all experiencing death equivalents in some fashion or another. And they're in a conversation about how they might collaborate. Some of them might be approaching this conversation as the problem that we need to solve is the decline of our churches, the struggle of our churches to maintain membership and income and facilities. And maybe we can solve this problem if we come together. That is an immortality project.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be inviting them to consider another problem that they might solve, which is some of the challenges that their wider community faces. What might these 5 churches do together to solve the problem and fill in the blank? It could be workforce development, it could be affordable housing, it could be affordable childcare, or any combination of those things. What might they do to solve that problem by coming together? So that is a question that I think takes us into the space of imagination. What can we do to save ourselves is a question that might provoke some cleverness or some strategy, but ultimately not, in my way of thinking, not imagination.
Yeah. I think that maybe plays on the question that David is asking.
Yeah.
You know, we can claim that coming together isn't really an imaginative thing. 5 congregations working together.
Mm-hmm.
But if the work is to recreate the old church, or is to hang on to what we've always known, that's not very imaginative.
Yeah, certainly.
That's not a real invitation to dream.
Mm-hmm. We need to bring this session to a close. Next week, same time, same Zoom link, we will take up the third and final question. How do we go through death as a community? Our theme is the practice of death, and we're going to consider through Rick's story of First Baptist of Palo Alto, its journey, and try to draw out of that some lessons, some principles, some practices around lamentation, liminal space, and discernment of new life. So, Rick, thank you again. Look forward to continuing the conversation next week. Thank you all for your participation, for your good comments and questions. Nancy has dropped one in here at the last minute. Do we need to resolve the problem to solve, or do we need to reimagine the problem to solve? I love that question. I think that's an imaginative question. I'm going to carry that with me through the day. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you all. Hopefully we'll get to see each other next week. Take care.
See you.